Are you ready to fall asleep with 100 differences between the 1970s and the 2020s in America? Let's begin. 1. Phone calls were made on rotary or push-button phones attached to walls with curly cords. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, the sound of a ringing phone came from a device that was literally attached to the wall by a long curly cord. These telephones had circular dials or simple push buttons, and calling someone meant standing or sitting close to where the phone was installed. Families often shared one household phone, and privacy meant stretching the cord down the hall or into another room. The click of the rotary wheel and the satisfying clatter as it spun back were familiar sounds in every home. Bright colors like mustard yellow, avocado green, and beige matched the kitchen appliances of the time. The cord would tangle hopelessly, and untangling it was a small domestic ritual. Phones were purely for conversation, no texting, no photos, no apps. Having a personal line was considered a luxury. Communication felt slower but more deliberate, and when the phone rang, everyone wondered who it could be. Those wall-mounted phones weren't just tools, they were gathering points for news, gossip, and human connection. 2. Long-distance calls cost extra per minute and were saved for special occasions. In the 1960s through the early 1990s, long-distance phone calls were expensive luxuries rather than everyday conveniences. Families planned them carefully, often saving them for birthdays, holidays, or major life events. Calling someone in another city, or worse, another country, meant paying by the minute. Parents would remind children to keep it short so the bill wouldn't skyrocket. People even memorized the exact times when phone rates dropped, like after 9 o'clock in the evening or on Sundays, to save a few precious dollars. A long-distance call often started with nervous excitement and ended with someone saying, "We'd better hang up before it costs too much." These calls carried emotional weight. Voices trembled with warmth or longing because there was no other easy way to connect across miles. When the conversation ended, the silence that followed felt both proud and lonely. Unlike today's endless connectivity, every minute of a long-distance call mattered. The cost of those moments made the words spoken during them more precious, treasured like letters or photographs. 3. If someone wasn't home, you simply tried calling back later, no voicemail. In the 1970s and early 1980s, before voicemail or answering machines became household staples, missing a call simply meant missing it. If you dialed a friend and they weren't home, the phone rang endlessly until you gave up. You had to wait and try again later, sometimes hours later, sometimes the next day. There was no text, no missed call log, and no way to know who had tried to reach you. Communication relied on patience and timing. Many families developed habits around expected calls. A friend might always call after dinner, or grandparents might phone every Sunday evening. When you finally connected, the joy was genuine, the conversation unhurried. Some people left handwritten notes by the phone saying, "So-and-so called." These notes became tiny records of daily life. The absence of instant contact made every conversation feel more intentional. You had to be present, both physically and mentally, because you couldn't just call back later whenever you wanted. It was a slower rhythm of life. And somehow, that slowness gave relationships a certain weight and sincerity that modern technology often lacks. 4. Writing letters by hand was the primary way to communicate with distant friends. From the early 20th century through the 1980s, handwritten letters were the heartbeat of long-distance communication. Stationery, envelopes, and postage stamps were everyday essentials, not nostalgic novelties. People wrote to friends, family, and even pen pals across oceans, carefully crafting words in ink that carried their emotions, stories, and secrets. Each letter felt deeply personal. The tilt of handwriting revealed mood, and the scent of the paper carried traces of home. Waiting for a reply could take days or weeks, making each arrival a small celebration. Families kept stacks of old letters tied with ribbons, physical reminders of love, friendship, and shared history. The act of writing demanded thoughtfulness. There was no backspace, no delete button, just ink and intent. Mailboxes were miniature windows to the world, and the sound of the postman's steps could quicken hearts. In those days, communication wasn't instant, but it was intimate. A handwritten letter wasn't just a message, it was a piece of the sender, preserved forever in paper and pen. 5. Payphones stood on nearly every street corner. During the 1970s and 1980s, payphones were the lifelines of public communication. You could find them in gas stations, shopping centers, schools, and nearly every street corner downtown. They were encased in metal booths or glass boxes, their walls etched with graffiti and taped flyers. For a few coins, usually 10 or 25 cents, you could make a local call. Long distance required more change, or even a calling card. Many people carried quarters in their pockets just in case. Payphones were lifelines for travelers, students, and anyone stranded after dark. They offered a sense of safety and connection in an unpredictable world. Some became local landmarks, meeting points, or silent witnesses to countless stories, breakups, emergencies, and goodbyes. The dial tone was a comfort, a hum that meant you could reach someone, somewhere. Today, their absence feels eerie. Those weathered booths once symbolized accessibility and trust in shared public space. You didn't need a smartphone, just a coin, a number, and a voice willing to answer. 6. The evening news at 6 o'clock was when most people learned what happened that day. Before 24-hour news channels and social media, the world's events arrived predictably each evening at 6 o'clock. Families gathered around the television, dinner plates clinking as the familiar faces of trusted anchors delivered the day's headlines. The broadcast was brief, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but it carried authority. This was how people learned about wars, elections, or local weather. News wasn't constant. It was curated and digested. You couldn't scroll or refresh. What you saw was what there was. Neighbors would discuss the stories later, often around fences or during morning commutes. The 6 o'clock news shaped public opinion and household conversation. The rhythm of life seemed to sync with that broadcast. It was a moment of collective pause when the world shrank into one shared narrative. Unlike today's torrent of information, this single daily ritual brought both simplicity and trust. You didn't need to chase the news. It came to you, once a day, with calm authority. 7. Missing a TV show meant waiting months for summer reruns. In the 1970s and 80s, missing your favorite television show was a small tragedy. There were no streaming services, no DVRs, and certainly no watch later buttons. If you weren't home when your show aired, you simply missed it. Fans circled airtimes in TV Guide and scheduled their evenings around them. Cliffhangers were torture because answers didn't come for weeks or even months. The only chance to catch up was during summer reruns, when networks re-aired popular episodes. Families would plan around these opportunities, finally watching the episodes everyone had talked about for months. This waiting built anticipation, deepened loyalty, and made television a shared experience. When an episode aired, people watched it together, reacting in real time. Missing it meant missing the cultural conversation. Today's instant access makes content disposable, but back then, shows felt precious. Each airing was an event, a once-in-a-lifetime appointment that, if missed, you could only hope to see again when the summer sun returned. 8. 3 major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, dominated all television. For much of the mid-20th century through the early 1980s, television in America was ruled by 3 giants: ABC, CBS, and NBC. These networks were the gatekeepers of entertainment and information, shaping what the nation watched, thought, and laughed about. With only a few channels available, programming was a shared cultural language. Families tuned in to the same comedies, dramas, and evening news programs. The networks competed fiercely for primetime audiences, and their logos became as familiar as family crests. Commercials were events too clever, catchy, and sometimes iconic. Television back then had a sense of unity. Everyone was part of the same conversation because options were limited. There were no streaming services, no cable overflow, just those 3 authoritative voices broadcasting into living rooms across the country. In many ways, the simplicity of this limited choice fostered community. The next morning at work or school, everyone could discuss last night's show. The networks didn't just broadcast, they defined eras. 9. Changing the channel required getting up and turning a dial. In the 1960s and 70s, television remotes were rare luxuries. Most families changed channels manually by walking up to the TV and turning a large, clunky dial. Each click produced a satisfying mechanical clunk, cycling through the handful of available stations. Children were often recruited as human remotes, sent to change the channel while parents stayed comfortably seated. The process encouraged commitment. You didn't channel surf. You chose what to watch and stuck with it. Adjusting the volume or fine-tuning reception often meant crouching near the screen, squinting at the static. The act of physically interacting with the television gave it a tactile quality. Watching was an experience that involved movement and effort. The remote control's invention in later decades seemed like magic, but it also erased that small shared family ritual. Back then, even switching channels was something you did together, an oddly intimate part of nightly life. 10. Rabbit ear antennas needed constant adjustment for clear reception. In the 1970s and early 1980s, television sets relied on rabbit ears, two metal antennas perched on top to capture broadcast signals. Picture quality was a fragile miracle. A gust of wind, a passing car, or even someone walking through the room could send the image into static chaos. Families became experts in antenna acrobatics, tilting, twisting, or extending the rods just right to bring the picture back. Aluminum foil was the universal fix, believed to boost the signal, though its effectiveness was debatable. Viewers would call out, "Don't move," when the image finally cleared, freezing whoever had found the sweet spot. Watching TV back then was half engineering, half entertainment. The imperfections, the flicker, the fuzz, were part of the experience. It made watching a show feel earned, like tuning into something fleeting and special. Today's crystal-clear streams may be effortless, but they lack that simple collective triumph of getting the rabbit ears just right. 11. Bank transactions required visiting a branch during business hours. In the 1970s and 1980s, banking was a face-to-face affair. There were no ATMs, no mobile apps, and certainly no online transfers. If you needed to deposit a check, withdraw cash, or pay a bill, you had to visit your local bank during business hours, usually from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. People stood in lines, filled out paper deposit slips, and spoke with tellers behind glass counters. Payday Fridays were especially busy, with long queues stretching to the door. Bank books, small paper ledgers, were stamped with every transaction, serving as the customer's record. There was a sense of personal connection. Tellers often knew clients by name. But banking was also slower and more rigid. Missing hours meant waiting until the next day. Despite the inconvenience, these in-person visits created a tangible trust between banks and customers. Money felt real, something you could hold, count, and track in ink, not just numbers on a screen. 12. Shopping meant driving to physical stores. Online shopping didn't exist. Before the rise of the internet in the 1990s, shopping meant getting in your car and visiting physical stores. Whether you needed clothes, groceries, or holiday gifts, every purchase required time and effort. Malls, department stores, and local shops were social spaces where people gathered, browsed, and compared prices. Window displays enticed shoppers, and seasonal sales drew crowds. Store clerks offered personal assistance, often remembering regular customers. Shopping trips were events, sometimes spanning entire afternoons. There were no online reviews, digital carts, or next-day delivery. You had to see, touch, and try everything yourself. Refunds and exchanges involved receipts, not apps. During Christmas, stores buzzed with carols and crowds, a kind of magic that online shopping never replicated. While today's convenience has erased much of that ritual, shopping once carried a sense of occasion, anticipation, and human connection that can't be clicked or shipped. 13. Catalogs from Sears and JCPenney were how people browsed products at home. In the 1960s through the 1980s, the Sears and JCPenney catalogs were the online stores of their time. These thick, glossy books arrived in mailboxes twice a year, filled with everything from clothing and furniture to toys and tools. Families spent evenings flipping through the pages, circling items they dreamed of owning. For children, the toy section, especially in the Christmas edition, was pure wonder. Orders were placed by phone or mail, often taking weeks to arrive. Catalogs turned shopping into a family ritual, bridging distance between rural homes and big city stores. The pages carried the scent of ink and the promise of modern living. When a new edition arrived, it felt like an event, an invitation to imagine a better life. Though the catalogs were eventually replaced by websites, their spirit lives on in digital browsing. They were, in many ways, the first window shopping experience from the comfort of home. 14. Encyclopedias were expensive multi-volume sets families saved up to buy. During the 1950s through the 1980s, owning a full set of encyclopedias was a mark of pride and education. These heavy, leather-bound volumes like Encyclopedia Britannica or World Book filled shelves in living rooms and studies. Families often bought them through door-to-door salesmen, paying in installments over months or years. Each set contained dozens of volumes, packed with maps, illustrations, and neatly organized knowledge from A to Z. Children used them for homework, and adults browsed them for answers before dinner conversations. In a pre-internet world, encyclopedias represented authority and curiosity. They were portals to the world, standing tall on bookshelves like silent teachers. Though updates required buying yearly supplements, families treasured these collections. They symbolized a belief that knowledge was worth saving for and that learning belonged in every home. 15. Research papers required hours in library card catalogs. In the 1970s and 80s, writing a research paper meant physically searching for information. No search engines, no instant results. Students visited libraries armed with pencils, index cards, and patience. The wooden card catalogue, with thousands of neatly typed drawers, was the gateway to knowledge. Each card listed an author, title, or subject, directing researchers to specific shelves. The process demanded focus and persistence. Finding one source often led to 3 more. Librarians became guides through this paper labyrinth, teaching generations how to navigate the Dewey Decimal System. Hours passed in quiet aisles, flipping pages, taking notes, and photocopying excerpts. Research wasn't just about finding information. It was about discovery and discipline. Every fact earned felt like a small triumph. Compared to today's instant searches, that world required time but also fostered a deeper connection to learning itself. 16. Photos took days or weeks to develop at drugstores. Before digital cameras in the early 2000s, taking photographs was an act of patience. In the 1970s through the 1990s, people dropped rolls of film at drugstores or photo labs, then waited several days, sometimes a week, for development. The moment you picked up the envelope of glossy prints was filled with anticipation. You never knew exactly how the pictures would turn out: blurry, overexposed, or accidentally perfect. Families often gathered around to sort them, laughing at candid moments or bad poses. Duplicates were made to share with friends. The delay made photography special. Every click of the camera meant something. You couldn't delete or edit, so each shot was a small risk, a bet on memory. That waiting period gave photos emotional weight, turning them into treasures rather than files. 17. You bought film in rolls of 24 or 36 exposures. In the 1980s and 90s, photography revolved around rolls of film that came in small, light-proof canisters. You had to choose between 24 or 36 exposures. Each click of the shutter counted. Before a trip or birthday, people checked how many frames were left, saving the last few for important shots. Changing film was a careful ritual done in subdued light, winding the spent roll and inserting a fresh one without exposing it to air. Photographers learned to plan, to frame thoughtfully, because mistakes wasted film. Once developed, the negatives were stored in envelopes or albums, tangible pieces of time. Today, we take hundreds of digital pictures without thinking. But back then, every photograph carried weight, a choice, a memory, and a cost. Film wasn't just about images, it was about mindfulness in capturing them. 18. Home videos required heavy camcorders and VHS tapes. In the 1980s and early 1990s, capturing home videos meant lugging around a bulky camcorder, often the size of a small suitcase. These machines recorded onto VHS tapes, which held about 2 hours of footage. Parents filmed birthdays, graduations, and family trips with unsteady hands and booming audio. Replaying memories meant sliding the tape into a VCR and gathering around the television. Editing was nearly impossible. You recorded life as it happened. The mechanical hum of the camera became part of family events. Its red record light a signal to smile. VHS tapes filled drawers and closets, labeled with dates and milestones. They were imperfect but heartfelt archives of ordinary life. Each grainy clip captured something that no smartphone ever could: the unfiltered warmth of a moment preserved in motion. 19. Music came on vinyl records, 8 tracks, or cassette tapes. Before CDs and streaming, music in the 1960s through the 1980s was deeply physical. You owned your songs on vinyl records, bulky 8 tracks, or cassette tapes. Each format had its charm. Vinyl offered rich sound and large album art. 8 tracks played continuously in cars. Cassettes fit in your pocket for portability. Listeners cleaned records carefully, flipped tapes with precision, and rewound songs using pencils when the tape jammed. Music wasn't just background noise, it was an activity. You sat, listened, and experienced the album as the artist intended. Collecting music meant curating part of your identity. Record stores were temples for fans, and mixtapes were love letters made of sound. In a world where every song required effort, music wasn't disposable, it was devotion. 20. Listening to specific songs meant buying entire albums. In the 1970s and 80s, if you loved a single song, you had to buy the entire album on vinyl or cassette. There were no playlists, downloads, or shuffle buttons. This meant discovering hidden gems, songs you hadn't expected to love. Albums were crafted with care, each track contributing to a larger story. Fans learned lyrics, memorized liner notes, and admired the artwork on record sleeves. Listening became a ritual, placing the needle, hearing the gentle crackle, and letting the music unfold. Radio stations might replay your favorite hit, but owning it meant committing to the full record. Sometimes, disappointment followed. Other times, it led to new favorites. That limitation created deeper appreciation. Each purchase was an investment, both emotional and financial. Music wasn't instant, it was earned, cherished, and replayed until the grooves wore thin. 21. Gas cost around 36 cents per gallon in 1970. In 1970, fueling up your car was surprisingly cheap by modern standards, only about 36 cents per gallon. Gas stations were friendly places where attendants pumped your fuel, washed your windshield, and checked your oil. Drivers often paid in cash or with simple paper receipts. Cars themselves guzzled more fuel, but few noticed since prices were so low. Families could take long road trips across states without worrying about costs. However, this era wouldn't last. By the mid-1970s, oil crises caused prices to surge. Still, the memory of cheap gas lingered like a golden age of freedom. Highways symbolized adventure, and a full tank meant the open road ahead. Today, the idea of paying pocket change for gas feels almost mythical, a relic from a slower, simpler America. 22. Cars had manual choke knobs and often required warming up. In the 1960s and early 1970s, starting a car was part science, part ritual. Engines used manual choke knobs to control fuel flow during ignition. On cold mornings, drivers would pull the choke, turn the key, and gently press the accelerator too much, and the engine flooded, too little, and it stalled. Warming up the car was essential, often taking several minutes before driving off. The sound of engines idling in driveways filled neighborhoods as people prepared for work. Patience was a virtue, and mechanical knowledge was common. You felt connected to your vehicle, understanding its quirks and moods. When engines finally roared to life, it was a small victory. Modern cars start with a button, but those old ones demanded care and rewarded it with loyalty. 23. Seatbelts were optional in many states. In the 1960s and early 1970s, wearing a seatbelt wasn't a legal requirement in most of the United States. Many cars didn't even have them installed in the back seats. Safety campaigns were rare, and most people simply didn't think about the risk. Parents drove with kids standing between the front seats or leaning out windows. It wasn't until the late 1980s that mandatory seatbelt laws became widespread. Before that, some drivers even tucked the belts under the seats, so they wouldn't get in the way. It was a different time, one that valued freedom and comfort over caution. Looking back, it's astonishing how normal it felt. Safety, as a culture, was something that had to be learned. 24. Children rode freely in cars without car seats. During the 1960s and 70s, car seats for children were almost unheard of. Kids sat on laps, stood on back seats, or lay across the rear window shelf during long drives. Parents didn't think twice, it was simply how things were. Family cars became playgrounds on wheels, filled with laughter and games of I Spy. Only later did safety research lead to stricter laws requiring child restraints. Back then, seatbelts were optional, and airbags didn't exist. Despite the dangers, those drives are remembered fondly, windows down, wind in hair, music playing on AM radio. It was a time of innocence and unawareness, when freedom mattered more than fear, and every family trip felt like an adventure. 25. Leaded gasoline was still common. In the 1970s, most gas stations sold leaded gasoline. The additive tetraethyl lead improved engine performance but polluted the air and harmed health. Drivers didn't think much about it. Signs simply read, regular, or ethyl. The faint, sweet smell of exhaust was part of daily life. Only in the late 1970s did environmental awareness grow, leading to the phase-out of leaded fuel. By the mid-1990s, it was banned in most countries. That shift marked a turning point in how society viewed technology and responsibility. Leaded gas once symbolized power and progress. In hindsight, it revealed how unaware people were of the hidden costs of convenience. 26. Cars averaged 13 miles per gallon. During the 1970s, fuel efficiency was a distant concern. The average car achieved only about 13 miles per gallon, guzzling gasoline as it roared down highways. Engines were large, powerful, and gloriously inefficient. Nobody cared much, gas was cheap, and speed was king. American muscle cars dominated the roads, their deep engines echoing through suburbs. It wasn't until the oil crises of the mid-1970s that efficiency became a priority. Automakers began shrinking engines, experimenting with lighter designs, and advertising miles per gallon for the first time. Still, those low-efficiency vehicles had character, chrome, power, and presence. They weren't practical, but they were unforgettable. 27. Air conditioning in cars was a luxury option. In the 1960s and 70s, air conditioning in cars was a luxury, not a standard feature. Only high-end models offered it, and most families rolled down windows instead. Summer drives meant sticky vinyl seats, open vents, and the wind whipping through hair. Some drivers installed small dashboard fans to cope with heat. Long road trips required timing, travel early in the morning or late at night to avoid sweltering afternoons. Having factory-installed air conditioning felt extravagant, a status symbol. By the 1980s, it became more common, but earlier generations still remember the smell of warm leather and the sound of rushing air as part of every summer memory. 28. Getting directions meant studying paper maps before trips. Before GPS and smartphones, travelers relied on paper road maps, often purchased at gas stations or AAA offices. In the 1970s and 80s, planning a trip meant unfolding enormous maps across tables, tracing routes with pens, and memorizing highway numbers. The navigator, often the passenger, played a crucial role, calling out turns and landmarks. Maps tore at the folds, and refolding them correctly was an art in itself. Each journey carried uncertainty, but also excitement. There was satisfaction in finding your way using logic, observation, and trust. A successful trip wasn't just about the destination. It was about proving you could get there on your own. 29. Getting lost meant stopping to ask strangers for help. In the 1970s, getting lost on the road was common and perfectly normal. Without GPS or cell phones, drivers relied on instincts, road signs, and the kindness of strangers. Gas station attendants were unofficial guides, armed with local knowledge. Stopping to ask for directions wasn't embarrassing. It was expected. Conversations often ended with smiles and hand gestures pointing just past the big oak tree. Sometimes you'd get lost again, but that was part of the adventure. Each wrong turn added a story, not frustration. Today's technology makes navigation effortless, but it has erased that small human exchange that once turned confusion into connection. 30. Airline travel required. Dressing up people wore suits and dresses. In the 1950s through the early 1980s, flying was a glamorous event. Passengers dressed as if attending a formal gathering, men in suits and ties, women in elegant dresses and gloves. Air travel was expensive, reserved for business trips or special vacations. Stewardesses, as they were called then, wore tailored uniforms and greeted passengers with poise. Meals were served on real plates, and seats offered generous space. The airport experience was polite, even prestigious. Families often took photos at terminals, proud of the journey ahead. Over time, as flights became affordable and frequent, formality faded, comfort replaced glamour. But those early decades of air travel remain legendary when taking to the skies truly meant something. 31. Secretaries typed documents on typewriters with carbon paper for copies. In the mid-20th century, secretaries were the backbone of office communication, relying heavily on manual or electric typewriters. Producing multiple copies of a document required inserting carbon paper between sheets, so each keystroke created duplicates through pressure. This process demanded precision. One typo could ruin every copy. Secretaries developed exceptional accuracy and speed, mastering techniques like touch typing and perfect alignment of margins. Unlike today's effortless digital editing, they had to plan layouts carefully before starting. Carbon paper left smudges on fingers, desks, and documents, but it was indispensable for creating copies before photocopiers became common. Filing clerks often handled stacks of these typed pages, organizing them into cabinets for record-keeping. The hum of typewriters, the clatter of keys, and the ringing of carriage returns defined office soundscapes. Secretaries were respected for their technical skill, neatness, and organizational ability. Their role extended beyond typing. They managed correspondence, scheduled meetings, and maintained office order. Before computers revolutionized administrative work, these professionals ensured businesses ran smoothly, using only mechanical tools and meticulous care. The simple act of typing a memo or report was a time-consuming craft requiring patience, precision, and a steady hand. 32. Correcting typing errors required whiteout or starting over. Before computers introduced backspace keys and word processors, correcting a typo was a frustrating ordeal. In the 1950s and 60s, secretaries and typists used liquid correction fluid, commonly known as whiteout or correction tape, to fix mistakes. Prior to its invention, a single misspelled word often meant retyping the entire page from scratch, especially for formal letters or contracts. Applying whiteout required shaking the bottle, brushing on a small dab, waiting for it to dry, and then carefully retyping the correct letter on top. Too much fluid left clumps, too little failed to hide the error. Carbon copies made things worse. Each copy beneath the original page preserved the mistake, forcing workers to redo everything. Speed and accuracy were critical. Employers valued typists who could maintain near-perfect results under pressure. Compared to modern editing, where errors vanish with a keystroke, typing back then demanded patience and practice. Offices even held speed typing contests to improve skill and accuracy. Whiteout, invented by Bette Nesmith Graham in 1956, was revolutionary because it saved time and reduced waste. Yet, it remained a symbol of the painstaking, manual precision that defined office work before digital tools made revisions effortless. 33. Fax machines wouldn't become common until the 1980s. Before the widespread adoption of fax machines in the 1980s, transmitting documents quickly over long distances was nearly impossible. Businesses relied on postal mail or expensive courier services for important paperwork, often waiting days for delivery. While early versions of facsimile technology existed as far back as the 19th century, they were cumbersome, costly, and rare in everyday offices. The arrival of the modern fax revolutionized communication by scanning printed pages and sending them over phone lines within minutes. Before this, contracts, signatures, and reports had to be mailed, leading to long delays and inefficiencies. The technology became mainstream only when telephone networks improved and machines became affordable for businesses of all sizes. The sound of a fax machine dialing and printing became iconic in the corporate world. Faxing allowed instant document sharing, bridging the gap between the typewriter era and the coming wave of digital communication. By the late 1980s, having a fax number was a standard part of doing business. Yet, before that time, most correspondence moved at the speed of the post office, prompting offices to plan well in advance and depend heavily on reliable mail systems for their daily operations. 34. Business meetings required everyone physically present. Before the advent of digital communication, business meetings were strictly in-person affairs. In the 1960s and 70s, executives, managers, and employees had to gather in the same room to discuss strategies, review reports, or sign contracts. Conference calls were rare and often plagued by poor sound quality. Most companies did not possess the technology to connect multiple offices remotely. This meant significant travel time and expenses, particularly for corporations with branches in different cities or countries. Boardrooms were central to company culture. Large wooden tables, notepads, ashtrays, and pitchers of water set the stage for every discussion. Meeting minutes were taken by hand or typed afterward by secretaries. Missing a meeting meant missing crucial information, as there were no video recordings or instant replays. Face-to-face interaction encouraged formality and personal accountability. Deals were sealed with handshakes rather than digital signatures. In contrast to today's flexible virtual work environments, the corporate world of that era relied entirely on physical presence and punctuality. Even small meetings involved significant coordination and travel logistics. The expectation was clear. Serious business required being there in person, no exceptions, no Zoom, and no excuses. 35. Working from home was virtually unheard of in most professions. In the mid-20th century, the concept of working from home was almost non-existent. Offices were considered the only legitimate place for professional work. Employees were expected to report physically each morning, dressed in formal attire, ready to complete their tasks under supervision. Homes lacked the tools necessary for office productivity. There were no personal computers, reliable printers, or fax machines available to individuals. Even telephone communication was limited, often controlled by company switchboards. Remote work was seen as impractical and unprofessional. Most companies believed productivity depended on direct oversight and collaboration within the workplace. Only a few professions, such as freelance writers or artists, occasionally worked from home. The idea of a home office was rare and sometimes even frowned upon. Commuting was part of the daily routine, reinforcing boundaries between personal and professional life. It wasn't until the rise of computers and the internet decades later that telecommuting became possible. During the 1950s and 60s, the very suggestion of doing office work from one's living room would have been met with skepticism. Work was a place, not an activity, and home was strictly for rest, not for business. 36. Finding a job meant checking newspaper classified ads. Before the internet transformed job hunting, people relied on the newspaper's classified ads section. Each morning, hopeful job seekers spread the paper across their kitchen table, scanning columns filled with abbreviations like F divided by T, EXP, RECT, and Apply in Person. The classified section, usually located near the back, was the lifeline for anyone seeking employment. There were no online listings, no email applications, and no resume uploads. If a job looked promising, applicants had to call the number listed, mail their resume, or physically visit the business to inquire. Local newspapers were essential for finding work within one's area, and Sunday editions often contained the largest listings. Career centers, employment agencies, and word-of-mouth referrals also played vital roles. Many people circled job ads in pen, clipped them out, and organized them into folders for tracking. The process was slower and more personal. Every application required effort, postage, and patience. Networking happened in person, not on social media. The job hunt of the 1960s or 70s required determination and persistence, as each opportunity involved real human interaction. Unlike today's digital flood of postings, finding employment meant truly chasing leads, one printed ad at a time. 37. Resumes were typed or professionally printed. Before digital templates and online submissions, resumes were physical documents that required careful preparation. In the 1960s and 70s, job seekers used typewriters or hired professional typists to create clean, error-free copies. Paper choice mattered. Cream or white bond paper with a watermark conveyed seriousness and professionalism. Even a single typo could ruin a candidate's chance, as corrections were nearly impossible without retyping the entire page. Once completed, resumes were folded neatly into envelopes and mailed along with cover letters, sometimes accompanied by postage-paid return envelopes. Presentation was everything. Layout, spacing, and alignment reflected one's attention to detail. Job applicants often kept multiple versions on hand for different positions, each typed individually. Photocopying was an option, but sometimes frowned upon due to quality loss. Resumes were stored in file folders or briefcases, ready to hand over during interviews. Professional printing shops also offered resume services, producing documents on high-quality stock using typesetting machines. Compared to today's fast, editable Word or PDF files, the process demanded patience, precision, and investment. A resume wasn't just a list of qualifications, it was a crafted piece of paper representing one's identity and potential in the professional world. 38. Office computers didn't exist for most workers. In the 1960s and even into the early 1980s, office computers were a rarity. Only large corporations or government institutions could afford massive mainframes, which filled entire rooms and required specialized operators. The average employee never touched a computer. Instead, all calculations, typing, and filing were done manually. Typewriters, telephones, and filing cabinets defined the typical workspace. Secretaries managed correspondence, accountants used ledgers, and managers relied on printed reports rather than digital dashboards. The first personal computers began to appear in the late 1970s, but they were expensive novelties that few offices adopted immediately. Most workers didn't encounter a computer until the 1980s, when desktop machines like the IBM PC began to spread. Before that, data processing was slow and centralized. Tasks we now complete with a few clicks required hours of paperwork. Training, filing, and even scheduling were all manual processes. The absence of computers shaped a work culture built on patience and routine. While productivity was lower by modern standards, people took pride in precision and craftsmanship. The introduction of office computers would later revolutionize not only efficiency, but also redefine the very structure of professional life. 39. File cabinets and paper files were how information was stored. Before digital storage and cloud systems, every piece of business information existed on paper. Offices were lined with metal filing cabinets, each drawer labeled meticulously with tags like invoices, personnel, or correspondence. Clerks spent entire days sorting, filing, and retrieving documents. File folders were color-coded, alphabetized, and cross-referenced using index cards. Important records were often duplicated with carbon copies and stored off-site for safety. Lost papers could mean serious setbacks. There was no search bar to find a missing report. Maintaining order required discipline, and skilled filing clerks were highly valued. Filing rooms smelled of paper, ink, and occasionally cigarette smoke. Periodic purges cleared outdated files to make room for new ones, with shredded documents hauled away by the bagful. Information sharing involved photocopying and physically walking documents from one office to another. Fireproof cabinets were used to protect crucial records from accidents. Compared to today's instantaneous digital retrieval, paper filing was slow, but tangible. Employees could literally hold a company's history in their hands. The rhythmic sound of drawers opening and closing formed the heartbeat of every mid-20th century office, where paperwork ruled and organization meant everything. 40. Calculators were large, expensive machines. In the 1950s and 60s, calculators were not the small plastic devices we know today, but bulky, mechanical, or early electronic machines. They occupied desk space and often required electricity or manual cranking. Businesses, engineers, and accountants relied on them for complex calculations that couldn't be done by hand. Before calculators became affordable, many people used slide rules, a precision tool requiring training to operate. Early electronic models from companies like Sharp or Texas Instruments cost hundreds of dollars, a significant investment at the time. These machines clicked and whirred as they processed numbers, printing results on narrow rolls of paper. Only high-level employees or accounting departments typically had access to one. Students and small businesses relied on pencil, paper, and mental arithmetic. By the 1970s, advances in microchips made pocket-sized calculators more common, transforming offices and classrooms alike. Yet in the earlier decades, performing calculations was a specialized task requiring both skill and equipment. The calculator's evolution marked a crucial step toward the computer age, shrinking from a desk-sized machine to a handheld tool, symbolizing the march of technology from the mechanical to the digital era. 41. Fast food was cheaper and seen as an occasional treat. In the mid-20th century, fast food was not an everyday habit but a special indulgence. Families might visit a burger stand or drive-in on Friday nights, often as a reward or convenience during road trips. Prices were low. A hamburger might cost 15 cents, but incomes were also modest, making eating out a luxury for many. Chains like McDonald's, A&W, and Dairy Queen were expanding rapidly, offering consistent meals and quick service. The concept of fast food fascinated people. It symbolized modern efficiency and post-war prosperity. However, most families still cooked meals at home from scratch, as convenience foods were limited. Eating fast food too often carried a hint of indulgence, even irresponsibility. Advertising portrayed it as fun and family-friendly, not a dietary staple. Children loved the novelty of paper-wrapped burgers and milkshakes, while parents appreciated the simplicity. Nutrition wasn't discussed much. Calories and fat content were rarely mentioned. Over time, as drive-thrus and advertising expanded, fast food shifted from occasional treat to daily routine. But in the 1950s and 60s, it remained something special, a cheerful outing rather than a default dinner option for busy households. 42. Drive-thrus were less common than walk-in counter service. In the 1950s and 60s, drive-thru restaurants were still a novelty. Most fast food places featured walk-up counters or indoor dining areas where customers ordered and carried their trays to booths. Drive-ins, where car hops brought food to parked cars, were more popular than true drive-thrus. McDonald's, Burger King, and other chains had not yet standardized the window-based ordering system that later defined convenience dining. People often enjoyed the social aspect of going inside. Families sitting together in bright vinyl booths, teenagers gathering with friends, and waitresses balancing trays of milkshakes and fries. The idea of never leaving one's car to eat was futuristic and slightly unusual. By the late 1970s, drive-thrus began spreading rapidly, especially as dual-income families and commuters sought faster meal options. However, in the earlier decades, dining, even fast dining, was still an experience meant to be shared face-to-face. The slower pace reflected a time when people lingered over meals, not rushed through them. The eventual rise of the drive-thru symbolized America's shift toward mobility, speed, and convenience. But for much of the mid-century, fast food meant walking up to the counter and enjoying a simple meal surrounded by neighbors and neon lights. 43. Microwave ovens were expensive novelties just appearing in homes. When microwave ovens first entered the consumer market in the 1960s, they were considered cutting-edge technology, expensive, bulky, and slightly mysterious. Early models cost several $100s, equivalent to thousands today, putting them out of reach for most households. Advertisements promoted them as futuristic radar ranges that could cook food in minutes, though many people were skeptical about their safety and taste results. Only the most modern kitchens featured one, and their size often required special counter space or built-in installation. Microwave cookbooks emerged, teaching homemakers how to adapt traditional recipes to this strange new device. Still, the majority of families relied on conventional ovens and stovetops for daily meals. By the late 1970s, prices dropped, and microwaves became more common, revolutionizing convenience cooking. But in the early years, using one was a conversation piece, not a norm. Guests might marvel at how a cup of coffee reheated by waves, or how popcorn popped in a plastic bowl. The microwave symbolized the coming of a faster, more automated age, a glimpse into the future when kitchens would cater to speed rather than tradition. 44. TV dinners in aluminum trays were cutting-edge convenience food. In the 1950s, TV dinners were the height of modern innovation. Introduced by Swanson in 1953, they offered families a new way to eat quickly without cooking from scratch. Packaged in divided aluminum trays, each meal included a main course, and sides, often turkey, with mashed potatoes and peas. The name TV dinner came from the popular habit of eating while watching television, a symbol of post-war leisure and family entertainment. Preparing one required only heating the tray in an oven for about 30 minutes, eliminating the need for pots, pans, or cleanup. For working mothers, they represented freedom from the daily grind of meal preparation. Though the food wasn't gourmet, the novelty outweighed quality concerns. Advertisements promised a complete meal in minutes, emphasizing convenience and modernity. The shiny aluminum tray itself became iconic, a technological marvel that embodied the optimism of the atomic age. Over time, these frozen meals evolved into countless varieties, eventually transitioning to microwavable packaging. Yet, in their early years, TV dinners were more than just food. They were cultural artifacts, celebrating progress and the promise of effortless living in an increasingly fast-paced world. 45. Organic food wasn't labeled or marketed as a category. Before the 1980s, the term organic rarely appeared in grocery stores. Most food was produced on small or regional farms, and the industrialization of agriculture was still developing. People bought fresh produce from local markets, roadside stands, or small grocers who sourced from nearby suppliers. Fertilizers and pesticides were used but not widely discussed, and consumers generally assumed that food was wholesome by default. The environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s began raising awareness about chemicals and food safety, but there were no standardized labels or certifications. Those who wanted naturally grown produce often relied on personal relationships with farmers rather than official guarantees. The modern organic industry, with dedicated aisles, branded packaging, and certification programs didn't exist. Food choices were simpler and less politicized. The focus was on freshness, price, and availability. Only later, with rising concerns about industrial farming and health, did organic food become a major market category. In the mid-century grocery store, the idea of paying extra for food labeled organic would have seemed unnecessary, even strange. Freshness came from the farm, not from a sticker promising purity. 46. Bottled water wasn't commonly purchased. In the mid-20th century, buying bottled water was nearly unheard of. Tap water was trusted, and public fountains were common in schools, parks, and office buildings. People carried thermoses or drank from cups, not disposable plastic bottles. The idea of paying for water seemed unnecessary when it flowed freely at home and in restaurants. Bottled water was reserved for emergencies or special situations, such as travel to places without reliable infrastructure. It wasn't until the late 1970s that brands like Perrier began marketing bottled water as a symbol of sophistication and health. Before that, soft drinks and milk dominated the beverage market. In workplaces, water coolers with paper cones were the standard way to stay hydrated. Plastic packaging technology was still developing, and environmental concerns about waste had yet to arise. The bottled water industry's eventual success reflected changes in lifestyle, convenience, and consumer trust. But during the 1950s and 60s, no one imagined shelves lined with dozens of water brands. Clean tap water was seen as a triumph of modern sanitation, safe, reliable, and more than good enough for everyone. 47. Coffee came in two varieties, regular or decaf. In offices and diners across America during the 1950s and 60s, coffee choices were simple, regular, or decaf. There were no espresso bars, flavored syrups, or specialty blends. Coffee was brewed in large percolators or drip pots and served black or with cream and sugar. Instant coffee, introduced after World War II, was also popular for its convenience. The culture of coffee was practical rather than indulgent. It fueled workdays, morning routines, and late-night conversations. Cafes didn't resemble today's artisanal coffee shops. They were functional places with Formica counters and endless refills for a dime. Brands like Folgers and Maxwell House dominated grocery shelves, advertising slogans such as "good to the last drop." Decaffeinated coffee, often labeled Sanka, was marketed toward older or health-conscious consumers. Coffee drinking was social but unpretentious. There were no lattes, cappuccinos, or iced brews. The rise of specialty coffee didn't come until decades later, when Starbucks and similar chains transformed it into an art form. But in mid-century America, coffee was a simple comfort, strong, straightforward, and part of nearly every adult's daily ritual. 48. Restaurant nutrition information wasn't available or required. In the mid-20th century, diners enjoyed meals without ever thinking about calories, fat, or sodium. Nutrition labeling laws didn't exist, and restaurants weren't required to share any information about their ingredients or preparation methods. People chose food based on taste, price, and familiarity, not nutritional value. Fast food menus simply listed items and prices, sometimes with bright photos of burgers or milkshakes, but never health data. Home cooks rarely calculated nutrients either. Recipes focused on flavor and convenience. Government guidelines for balanced eating were broad and rarely publicized. The idea of counting calories or avoiding cholesterol became common only in later decades, as science and public awareness evolved. In the 1950s and 60s, most Americans trusted restaurants to serve wholesome, satisfying meals. Portion sizes were smaller, but so was concern about diet-related illness. Eating out was a pleasure, not a negotiation between health and indulgence. The modern concept of transparent menus with calorie counts, allergen warnings, and vegan symbols would have seemed unnecessary. Back then, ignorance was culinary bliss, and meals were judged by how they tasted, not by how many grams of fat or sugar they contained. 49. Food delivery meant pizza that was essentially it. In the 1960s and 70s, food delivery was a rare convenience, and pizza dominated the scene. Pizzerias were among the first restaurants to offer home delivery because their food traveled well and stayed warm. Drivers carried insulated bags or cardboard boxes, often balancing several orders in old sedans without GPS or smartphones. Other types of food, Chinese, burgers, or sandwiches, were typically takeout only. Customers picked up meals themselves. The idea of having a full restaurant menu delivered to one's home simply didn't exist. Delivery was a local cash-based service limited to nearby neighborhoods. Families viewed pizza night as a special treat, often ordering from a single favorite place. Ads proudly proclaimed, "We deliver," as if it were a luxury feature. Decades later, as urbanization grew and technology advanced, food delivery evolved into a vast industry. But in the mid-century, pizza delivery symbolized novelty and community connection. Everyone knew the local delivery driver, and a knock on the door with a hot pie was cause for excitement. It was a simple pleasure, one of the earliest signs of convenience culture, long before apps turned food delivery into a daily habit. 50. Doggy bags from restaurants were common and expected. During the 1950s and 60s, diners often asked for doggy bags without hesitation. The term originally referred to taking leftovers home for the dog, a polite fiction to avoid seeming wasteful or greedy. In truth, most people ate the food themselves later. Portions were generous, and bringing leftovers home was both practical and economical. Restaurants provided sturdy paper or foil containers, sometimes even labeled with cheerful designs. The practice reflected a culture that valued thrift and disliked throwing away good food. Unlike today's eco-conscious packaging, early doggy bags weren't focused on sustainability. They were about saving money and savoring another meal. In an era before microwaves were common, leftovers were reheated in ovens or skillets. Taking food home was so normal that many waiters automatically offered to wrap uneaten portions. Over time, the custom evolved, with the term to-go box replacing doggy bag as dining became more formalized. Yet the original idea remained the same, a practical way to stretch a good meal into tomorrow. It was a small but meaningful reflection of post-war sensibility, respect for value, appreciation for food, and a quiet rejection of wastefulness. 51. Smoking was allowed in restaurants, offices, hospitals, and airplanes. Before public health awareness grew in the late 20th century, smoking was almost universally accepted indoors. In restaurants, ashtrays sat on every table. In offices, cigarettes burned beside typewriters. In hospitals, doctors and visitors smoked freely in waiting rooms. Even airplanes had designated smoking sections, though the smoke drifted everywhere. Cigarettes were seen as symbols of sophistication, stress relief, or social grace. Television and movies glamorized the habit nearly every adult smoked. Ventilation systems were weak, and walls often carried the yellow stains of nicotine. Non-smokers had little recourse. The idea of banning smoking in public places was practically unthinkable. By the 1970s, growing scientific evidence linked smoking to cancer and heart disease, sparking the first health campaigns and designated non-smoking areas. Still, it took decades for comprehensive bans to emerge. The mid-century world smelled of tobacco, a scent inseparable from everyday life. Lighting a cigarette was as routine as pouring coffee. Looking back, it's hard to imagine that hospitals and airplanes once tolerated clouds of smoke, but for much of the 20th century, it was simply part of the social and professional landscape. 52. Cigarette commercials aired on television until 1971. In the early years of television, cigarette commercials were among the most common and glamorous ads. Brands like Lucky Strike, Camel, and Marlboro sponsored entire programs and even had celebrities endorse their products. Smooth-voiced narrators promised relaxation, confidence, and sophistication. Iconic jingles such as "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should" became part of popular culture. Tobacco advertising was everywhere on billboards, in magazines, and across radio waves. Few questioned the health risks, and even doctors appeared in some ads to promote mild or low-tar brands. However, by the late 1960s, mounting medical evidence and public pressure led to regulatory action. In 1970, Congress passed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, which banned cigarette advertising on television and radio, starting January 1, 1971. The ban marked a turning point in public health awareness and media responsibility. Afterward, tobacco companies shifted their focus to print and sponsorships, such as auto racing and concerts. But for decades prior, cigarette commercials shaped the image of smoking as a normal, even desirable, part of American life, an image that took generations to reverse. 53. Ashtrays were standard furniture in homes and offices. In mid-century America, ashtrays were as common as lamps or clocks. Every home, office, restaurant, and car contained several, reflecting the ubiquity of smoking. They came in every shape and material: glass, ceramic, metal, even souvenir designs from vacation spots. Coffee tables, desks, and nightstands often had ashtrays within arm's reach. In offices, employees smoked while typing, holding meetings, or answering phones, and janitors regularly emptied overflowing ashtrays. Decorative sets were even given as wedding or housewarming gifts. Cleaning them was a routine household task, and the faint smell of smoke clung to curtains and upholstery. Non-smokers, though fewer in number, tolerated it as normal. Over time, as attitudes towards smoking changed, ashtrays disappeared from workplaces and public spaces. By the late 1980s, they had become relics of an earlier era collectibles rather than necessities. Yet for decades, they symbolized hospitality and comfort. Offering a cigarette and an ashtray to a guest was a gesture of friendliness. It's almost unimaginable today, but once upon a time, the soft clink of an ashtray was a familiar soundtrack to everyday American life. 54. Doctors smoked in their offices while seeing patients. In the 1950s and early 60s, smoking was so ingrained in daily life that even doctors lit cigarettes in their offices, sometimes during patient consultations. Cigarette brands even featured physicians in their advertisements, implying professional approval. The medical community hadn't yet fully accepted the dangers of tobacco, and many doctors saw smoking as a harmless way to relieve stress during long shifts. Patients might find ashtrays on the examination desk or see their doctor puffing thoughtfully while giving advice. The irony is striking today, but at the time, smoking carried no social stigma, even in healthcare settings. Only after the Surgeon General's groundbreaking report in 1964 did the medical profession begin discouraging smoking. Hospitals slowly adopted no-smoking policies, though enforcement was inconsistent for years. The sight of a physician with a cigarette symbolized an era of limited awareness, when even the most educated professionals underestimated the risks of their own habits. It serves as a striking reminder of how cultural norms can overshadow scientific truth, and how drastically public health attitudes have evolved since that smoke-filled age. 55. Mental health treatment carried enormous stigma. In the mid-20th century, mental health was a taboo subject. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other disorders often hid their struggles out of fear of judgment. Seeking therapy or psychiatric help was seen as shameful or a sign of weakness. Many families kept such issues secret, worried about gossip or social exclusion. Treatment options were limited, and institutions for severe cases were often overcrowded and poorly managed. The public associated mental illness with danger or instability, not with treatable medical conditions. Films and news reports of the time reinforced these stereotypes. Psychiatrists existed, but few people sought their help voluntarily. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that broader awareness and compassion began to grow, helped by activism and evolving science. Before then, mental health wasn't part of everyday conversation. The topic made people uncomfortable, and emotional struggles were often dismissed with phrases like, "pull yourself together." The silence surrounding mental illness caused generations of suffering in secrecy. Thankfully, the stigma has diminished over time, but in those earlier decades, acknowledging psychological pain was one of society's deepest taboos. 56. Seatbelts weren't required by federal law until 1968. For much of automobile history, cars had no seatbelts at all. Drivers and passengers relied on metal dashboards and sheer luck for safety. Even when seatbelts became available, many people ignored them, believing they were unnecessary or restrictive. Automakers worried that promoting seatbelts might suggest their cars were unsafe. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that safety advocates, led by figures like Ralph Nader, began pushing for change. In 1968, the US federal government finally mandated that all new cars include seatbelts as standard equipment. However, wearing them remained optional in most states for years afterward. Early public service campaigns encouraged use with slogans like, "Buckle up for safety," but compliance was low. Many drivers tucked seatbelts behind seats to avoid the nuisance. Gradually, awareness grew as studies proved seatbelts saved lives. The shift from resistance to acceptance was slow but transformative. By the late 20th century, buckling up became second nature. Yet before that law, millions drove unrestrained on highways, unaware that such a simple strap could mean the difference between life and death. 57. Motorcycle helmets weren't required in most states. During the 1950s and 60s, motorcycle riders often sped along open roads with the wind in their hair and no helmet in sight. The culture of motorcycling emphasized freedom, rebellion, and risk-taking, inspired by movies like The Wild One. Safety regulations were minimal, and helmets were considered optional, even unfashionable. Riders prized visibility and comfort over protection, despite rising accident rates. It wasn't until the late 1960s and early 70s that safety organizations began urging helmet laws, backed by new research showing how head injuries could be prevented. Some states eventually passed mandatory helmet laws, but many motorcyclists resisted, viewing them as infringements on personal liberty. Public opinion was deeply divided, and protests were common. Early helmets were heavy and uncomfortable, offering little ventilation. As technology improved, lighter and stronger materials made them more acceptable. Still, in the mid-century era, riding bareheaded, symbolized defiance and independence. The eventual push for safety transformed motorcycle culture. But for decades, the open road meant true freedom, danger, and all. 58. Sunscreen wasn't widely used or understood as necessary. In the 1950s and 60s, suntans were symbols of health, beauty, and leisure. People spent long hours outdoors with little protection, using tanning oils or baby oil mixed with iodine to deepen their color. Sunscreen existed in rudimentary forms, but few understood its importance in preventing skin cancer. Advertisements promoted the golden glow as glamorous, while pale skin was considered outdated or unhealthy looking. Parents let children play outside all day without reapplication or concern for UV rays. Only in later decades did medical research reveal the dangers of prolonged sun exposure. Early products like Coppertone offered minimal protection, more focused on enhancing tans than blocking radiation. The concept of SPF ratings didn't become standardized until the 1970s. Before then, sunburns were shrugged off as temporary discomforts, not warning signs. Beachgoers slathered on oil, not lotion, chasing a bronze look that defined summer fashion. Today's sunscreen culture, with daily application and awareness campaigns, stands in stark contrast to an era when the sun was seen purely as a source of vitality and style. 59. Lead paint was still in many homes. Throughout the mid-20th century, lead-based paint was used extensively in homes, schools, and public buildings. Its durability, vibrant color, and resistance to moisture made it a popular choice. Parents painted nurseries, unaware that the same bright walls could later poison their children through dust or paint chips. Health warnings existed as early as the 1920s, but regulations were weak and inconsistently enforced. It wasn't until 1978 that the United States banned lead paint for residential use. Before then, maintenance workers often scraped or sanded old paint without protection, unknowingly spreading toxic particles. Children were especially vulnerable, as lead exposure affected brain development and behavior. Despite its dangers, lead paint symbolized quality craftsmanship and long-lasting beauty. The eventual discovery of its harm marked a turning point in public health and building safety. Many older homes today still require costly lead abatement, lingering reminders of an era when industrial progress outpaced medical understanding. In its time, lead paint was a household staple, trusted, reliable, and tragically misunderstood. 60. Asbestos was common in buildings and schools. For much of the 20th century, asbestos was considered a miracle material. Its fire-resistant and insulating properties made it ideal for construction, from ceiling tiles and floor coverings to insulation and brake linings. Factories, schools, and homes built during the 1940s through 70s often contained it in walls and pipes. Workers handled it daily, unaware of its deadly consequences. The fine fibers, once inhaled, could lodge in the lungs, causing asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma diseases that sometimes took decades to appear. By the time scientists linked asbestos exposure to serious illness, millions had already been affected. Despite growing evidence, it wasn't fully banned in many countries until the late 20th century. During its peak use, asbestos symbolized modern safety and progress. It protected buildings from fire and improved efficiency. Ironically, the safe material became one of the most hazardous substances in industrial history. Today, asbestos removal is tightly regulated, but the remnants of that era still linger in old schools and homes, a sobering testament to how ignorance and optimism once coexisted in the name of progress. 61. Interracial marriage had only been legal nationwide since 1967. Before the landmark Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967, interracial marriage was illegal in many states across the United States. The ruling struck down all remaining state laws banning marriage between people of different races, marking a pivotal moment in civil rights history. Before this, couples faced arrest, fines, and social ostracism simply for loving someone of another race. Even after the decision, many interracial couples endured discrimination, harassment, and exclusion from family and community circles. The change was monumental, not only legally, but also culturally, as it began to redefine societal perceptions of race, love, and equality. Today, interracial marriages are far more accepted, but the courage of couples who defied unjust laws laid the foundation for a more inclusive nation. The Loving decision continues to symbolize the triumph of love over prejudice, reminding Americans that the right to marry freely is a fundamental aspect of personal liberty and human dignity. 62. Women couldn't get credit cards without a husband's permission until 1974. Until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974, women in the United States were often denied financial independence. Banks and credit institutions routinely required a husband, father, or male co-signer before granting a woman a credit card or loan, regardless of her income or financial stability. This systemic discrimination restricted women's autonomy, limiting their ability to buy homes, start businesses, or build credit histories in their own names. Many working women faced the demeaning practice of having credit lines automatically transferred to their husbands. The passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act changed everything, prohibiting lenders from discriminating based on gender or marital status. This reform empowered women to gain control over their finances and pursue independence on equal footing with men. The change became a vital step toward gender equality, helping reshape the economic landscape of America and ensuring women could manage their money, credit, and futures without male oversight or permission. 63. Pregnancy discrimination in employment was legal until 1978. Before the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, it was perfectly legal for employers to fire, demote, or refuse to hire women because they were pregnant. Many women were forced to leave their jobs once they began to show, regardless of their ability to continue working. Companies often denied maternity benefits or treated pregnancy as a disability, stripping women of income and opportunity during a critical time. This practice not only harmed women financially, but also reinforced stereotypes that motherhood and professionalism were incompatible. The 1978 law, which amended Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, made it illegal to discriminate against women for pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. This legislation was a milestone for working women, allowing them to remain in the workforce without fear of punishment for starting families. It signaled a cultural shift toward recognizing women as both mothers and professionals, with equal rights to fair treatment and economic security. 64. Marital rape wasn't illegal in most states. For much of American history, the law did not recognize rape within marriage as a crime. Until the late 20th century, most states maintained marital exemptions, meaning husbands could not be prosecuted for raping their wives. The assumption was that marriage implied perpetual consent, a belief rooted in centuries-old patriarchal laws. It wasn't until the late 1970s through the 1990s that states began dismantling these archaic statutes. By 1993, marital rape was finally illegal in all 50 states, though enforcement and penalties still varied. The legal change reflected growing awareness of women's bodily autonomy and human rights. Feminist movements, survivor advocacy, and shifts in public consciousness challenged the notion that marriage excused sexual violence. The recognition of marital rape as a crime marked a profound turning point in both law and culture, affirming that consent must exist within every relationship and that marriage does not grant ownership of one's partner's body. 65. LGBTQ individuals had no federal employment protections. For decades, LGBTQ Americans could be legally fired or denied employment simply because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. There were no federal protections guaranteeing equal treatment in the workplace until the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock v. Clayton County in 2020. Prior to that, only a patchwork of state and local laws offered limited safeguards. Many LGBTQ workers hid their identities, fearing discrimination, harassment, or job loss. The lack of protection perpetuated economic instability and psychological stress for countless individuals. Activists and legal organizations fought for years to extend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to cover sexual orientation and gender identity under the category of sex. The Bostock ruling finally confirmed that Title VII does protect LGBTQ employees from workplace discrimination, establishing a historic precedent for equality. This legal milestone affirmed that every person, regardless of who they love or how they identify, deserves dignity and fairness in employment. 66. Divorce carried significant social stigma. In the mid-20th century, divorce was widely viewed as a personal failure and moral disgrace. Religious institutions, communities, and even families often ostracized divorced individuals, especially women. The notion of broken homes carried deep shame, and divorced people were sometimes excluded from social gatherings or religious participation. Women who divorced were frequently blamed for failing to maintain their marriages, regardless of the circumstances. Until no-fault divorce laws began spreading in the 1970s, couples had to prove wrongdoing such as adultery or cruelty to legally end a marriage, making the process both humiliating and invasive. As cultural attitudes shifted and legal reforms simplified divorce proceedings, the stigma gradually faded. By the late 20th century, divorce became more common and socially acceptable, recognized as a legitimate means of seeking happiness and safety. This change reflected broader societal movements toward individual freedom, gender equality, and mental well-being, allowing people to redefine their lives beyond traditional marital expectations. 67. Single motherhood was deeply stigmatized. Throughout much of the 20th century, being a single mother was seen as shameful and socially unacceptable. Women raising children without husbands were often labeled as irresponsible or immoral, regardless of their circumstances. Many faced economic hardship, limited job opportunities, and discrimination in housing or education. Some were pressured into marriage, forced adoptions, or institutionalization to conceal illegitimacy. Popular media reinforced negative stereotypes, portraying single mothers as societal burdens rather than resilient caregivers. It wasn't until the late 1970s and beyond that attitudes began shifting, influenced by feminist advocacy, changing family structures, and the growing recognition of diverse household forms. Government support programs also began addressing single-parent needs, reflecting evolving public empathy. Today, single motherhood is far more normalized, with society celebrating women's strength and independence. However, the historic stigma serves as a reminder of how gendered expectations once constrained women's choices and defined worthiness by marital status, rather than personal capability or love for their children. 68. Most offices had explicit dress codes requiring suits and ties. In the mid to late 20th century, workplace dress codes were formal and rigid. Men were expected to wear suits, ties, and polished shoes daily, while women had to adhere to conservative standards. Skirts, stockings, and modest blouses were mandatory. Casual clothing was viewed as unprofessional, even in creative industries. Dress codes symbolized discipline, authority, and respectability in corporate culture. Companies often enforced these standards strictly, with violations seen as reflections of poor character or work ethic. It wasn't until the late 1980s and 1990s, with the rise of Silicon Valley and casual Fridays, that attitudes began to relax. Tech companies popularized more comfortable, expressive clothing, marking a shift toward valuing innovation over appearance. Today's offices embrace diversity and flexibility in dress, allowing employees to balance professionalism with individuality. The evolution of workplace attire mirrors broader social trends, challenging hierarchy, promoting inclusivity, and redefining what it means to look professional in a modern creative economy. 69. Children played outside, unsupervised, from morning until dinner. In the mid-20th century, childhood was marked by freedom and independence. Kids spent entire days exploring neighborhoods, riding bikes, and playing games outdoors with little to no adult supervision. Parents trusted that their children would return home by dinner, and the community collectively watched over them. This era, long before smartphones or GPS trackers, fostered creativity, resilience, and social skills. Children built forts, climbed trees, and invented their own adventures, learning responsibility through experience rather than constant oversight. Stranger danger fears and suburban safety concerns in later decades gradually ended this era of unsupervised play. By the early 2000s, structured activities and digital entertainment replaced spontaneous outdoor exploration. While modern children have greater access to technology and organized learning, many nostalgic adults recall that freer time as an essential part of growing up, one that encouraged imagination, independence, and deep neighborhood bonds rarely seen in today's cautious, screen-centered world. 70. Latchkey kids, letting themselves into empty homes was normal. During the 1970s and 80s, the phenomenon of latchkey kids became widespread. With rising divorce rates and more women entering the workforce, many children came home from school to empty houses, using their own keys to let themselves in. These children often spent hours alone, watching television, doing homework, or preparing snacks until their parents returned from work. Society viewed this independence with mixed feelings. Some saw it as a sign of maturity and adaptability, while others worried about neglect and safety risks. Despite the challenges, latchkey kids developed resourcefulness, responsibility, and problem-solving skills that shaped an entire generation. The term became a cultural emblem of the changing family dynamics of the late 20th century, reflecting shifts in gender roles, economics, and parenting styles. Today, with after-school programs and digital monitoring, the concept feels almost nostalgic, a symbol of an era when kids grew up balancing independence with resilience in a rapidly modernizing world. 71. Video games didn't exist in homes until Pong arrived in 1975. Before the arrival of Pong in 1975, the concept of playing video games at home was virtually non-existent. Entertainment revolved around television, board games, and outdoor activities. When Atari released Pong, a simple yet revolutionary table tennis-style game, it became one of the first commercially successful home video games. Players could connect it directly to their televisions and compete using knobs to control on-screen paddles. Though primitive by today's standards, Pong was groundbreaking. It introduced millions of households to interactive digital entertainment. Its simplicity made it universally appealing, and it ignited the birth of a multi-billion-dollar industry. By the late 1970s, new consoles and arcade machines began appearing everywhere, transforming how families spent leisure time. Pong's release marked the dawn of a technological and cultural shift, paving the way for gaming legends like Nintendo, Sega, and later Sony and Microsoft. The game's enduring legacy lies not just in its pixelated simplicity, but in how it transformed screens from passive displays into interactive playgrounds. Pong wasn't just a novelty. It was the spark that ignited decades of innovation and creativity in digital entertainment across generations. 72. Arcades with pinball machines were teenage hangout spots. Before home gaming systems became widespread, teenagers flocked to arcades filled with flashing lights, buzzing sounds, and the rhythmic clatter of pinball machines. During the 1960s through the early 1980s, these arcades were social hubs where young people gathered after school or on weekends. Pinball required skill, reflexes, and precision, and mastering a machine could earn players respect among their peers. The atmosphere was electric, dim lighting, neon signs, jukebox music, and the smell of soda and popcorn filled the air. For many, the arcade represented freedom from parental supervision and a place to forge friendships. When video games like Space Invaders and Pac-Man arrived in the late 1970s, they joined pinball as cultural icons, revolutionizing leisure time. Although arcades have largely declined due to home consoles and online gaming, their influence endures. The arcade era helped shape modern gaming culture and community spaces, symbolizing a time when entertainment was tactile, communal, and built around the thrill of shared experiences in glowing, coin-filled rooms of excitement and noise. 73. Board games and card games were primary evening entertainment. Before digital distractions dominated living rooms, families bonded over board games and card nights. During the mid-20th century, games like Monopoly, Scrabble, Clue, and Life were staples in households across America. Evenings often centered around the kitchen table, where laughter, friendly rivalry, and strategy filled the air. Card games such as poker, bridge, and rummy offered both entertainment and social connection. These activities encouraged critical thinking, patience, and interaction in ways that screens never could. For many, board games were an escape from daily stress and a means of fostering family unity. They taught negotiation, teamwork, and sportsmanship, creating memories that lasted long after the final move. As television became more popular, some families shifted away from traditional games, but they never vanished. Today, board games have experienced a renaissance, evolving into complex, story-driven experiences that bring people together once more. The era when dice and cards ruled the night reminds us that the best entertainment often requires nothing more than good company, imagination, and a shared spirit of play. 74. Drive-in movie theaters were popular date destinations. During the 1950s through the 1970s, drive-in movie theaters became beloved symbols of American leisure and romance. These open-air cinemas allowed moviegoers to watch films from the comfort and privacy of their cars, creating a relaxed and intimate atmosphere perfect for dates. Teens and couples would park under the stars, tune into the movie's audio through car speakers, and enjoy snacks from the concession stand. Drive-ins weren't just about movies, they were cultural experiences that combined entertainment with social gathering. Families brought children in pajamas, while groups of friends filled pickup trucks with blankets and laughter. The drive-in era thrived during America's car culture boom, but began to decline with the rise of indoor multiplexes in the late 1970s. Despite their fall, drive-ins experienced revivals during times of nostalgia or social distancing, symbolizing simpler days when film, freedom, and the open night sky blended perfectly. They remain cherished memories of a time when a car and a screen could make magic on warm summer nights. 75. Bowling alleys were major social centers. In mid-20th century America, bowling alleys were vibrant community gathering places. Families, friends, and co-workers met regularly for league nights or weekend outings, making bowling a key part of social life. The sound of crashing pins, the smell of shoe spray, and the hum of jukebox tunes defined the experience. Bowling was affordable, casual, and inclusive. Anyone could play regardless of age or athletic ability. It was both recreation and competition, often followed by burgers and milkshakes in attached diners. In the 1950s and 60s, bowling's popularity soared, with televised tournaments turning bowlers into celebrities. Corporate leagues also became bonding rituals among employees. As entertainment options expanded in later decades, bowling's cultural dominance faded, but it never disappeared. Today, retro-style alleys with neon lights and craft food have revived the sport's charm for new generations. Bowling remains a nostalgic symbol of community connection, where friendly rivalry, laughter, and shared tradition roll together to create simple, lasting joy. 76. Reading physical newspapers was the morning routine. For much of the 20th century, the day began not with a screen but with the rustle of a newspaper. Reading the morning paper was a ritual. Adults sipped coffee while scanning headlines, editorials, and comic strips. Delivery boys tossed rolled newspapers onto porches before dawn, and families often shared sections around the breakfast table. The printed paper connected citizens to world events, politics, and local news, shaping public opinion and civic awareness. Sunday editions were particularly special, packed with inserts, crossword puzzles, and colorful advertisements. Newspapers weren't just informative, they were tactile, communal experiences that shaped daily rhythms. The decline of print began with 24-hour television news and accelerated with the internet in the late 1990s. Yet, even in the digital era, holding a physical newspaper retains nostalgic appeal. It symbolizes slower, more intentional living, a time when people absorbed information thoughtfully, page by page, instead of scrolling rapidly through fleeting digital headlines. 77. Comic books cost 15 to 25 cents. In the 1960s and early 1970s, comic books were an affordable escape into worlds of heroes, villains, and adventure. Costing between 15 and 25 cents, they were easily accessible to children and teenagers, often purchased with pocket change from corner stores or newsstands. This affordability fueled the golden age of comic culture, when icons like Spider-Man, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the X-Men shaped youthful imaginations. Comics provided moral lessons, escapism, and inspiration during turbulent social times. They also reflected broader cultural issues, from civil rights to gender roles disguised beneath capes and superpowers. Collecting comics became a cherished hobby, with some rare issues later turning into valuable collectibles. As prices and production values rose in later decades, the innocence of the cheap, staple-bound comic faded. Yet, those small, colorful pages captured something timeless, the magic of storytelling accessible to everyone, proving that even for a quarter, imagination could soar beyond the stars. 78. Movie tickets cost around $1.50. During the 1970s, going to the movies was both affordable and beloved. Tickets averaged about $1.50, making cinema one of the most popular pastimes for families and young adults alike. For that modest price, audiences could experience epic adventures, romance, or laughter on the big screen, complete with popcorn and soda for under $5 total. The theater was more than entertainment. It was a shared social event. Lines wrapped around the block for blockbuster hits like Jaws and Star Wars, creating a sense of communal excitement. The affordability meant that moviegoing wasn't a luxury, it was a weekly ritual. As inflation and production costs rose, ticket prices climbed, and the communal magic began to shift toward home viewing. Still, the 1970s theater experience remains iconic, a golden era when the silver screen united audiences from all walks of life for a few hours of wonder, all for less than $2. 79. Blockbuster films took months to reach smaller towns. Before the age of digital distribution, film releases rolled out slowly across the country. In the 1960s and 70s, major cities premiered movies first, while smaller towns sometimes waited months for the same titles to arrive. Film reels had to be physically shipped between theaters, limiting how many places could show a movie at once. For people in rural or suburban areas, anticipation built as they read reviews or heard stories from friends who had already seen the film. When the movie finally arrived, it felt like an event, a long-awaited moment that brought the whole community together. The staggered release system also made certain movies feel exclusive or legendary. The excitement of finally getting a big movie created a shared sense of cultural participation that streaming has since replaced. Today's instant access offers convenience, but something nostalgic remains about waiting, imagining, and then gathering in small-town theaters to experience the magic of cinema's grand arrival. 80. Going to the movies meant assigned seating wasn't available. In the days before online ticketing and luxury cinemas, movie seating was purely first come, first served. Audiences lined up outside theaters, sometimes for hours, to secure the best spots. Once the doors opened, people hurried to claim prime seats in the middle rows, creating a sense of excitement and community anticipation. This ritual made moviegoing a shared adventure. Friends saved seats, strangers exchanged small talk, and the collective buzz built as the lights dimmed. Without reserved seating, the experience was spontaneous and lively. Theaters were packed for popular films, and latecomers often had to sit in the front row or stand in the aisles. Though modern theaters offer comfort and convenience, the old system carried a certain thrill and social energy that's hard to replicate. It reflected a time when entertainment was more communal, and the act of going to the movies was as important as the film itself. A cherished ritual of spontaneity, patience, and shared anticipation. 81. The minimum wage of 1970. In 1970, the minimum wage stood at $1.60 per hour. Though it may sound small by today's standards, that amount stretched surprisingly far. A gallon of gas cost less than 40 cents, and a loaf of bread could be bought for under a quarter. Workers earning the minimum wage could manage rent, groceries, and modest luxuries without constant financial strain. Many families lived on single incomes, often with one parent staying home. Despite the lower pay, the cost of living aligned with the times. That era reflected a slower rhythm. People saved more, spent carefully, and valued stability over excess. The wage symbolized a balance between effort and reward, a snapshot of a working-class America built on resilience and practicality. 82. The average home price of 1970. In 1970, the average home price hovered around $23,000. For many families, owning a house wasn't a distant dream but an attainable goal. Mortgage rates were higher than today, yet the modest prices balanced the equation. Homes were smaller but sturdier, often built with real wood and craftsmanship that endured decades. Suburban neighborhoods flourished, with tidy lawns and the occasional white picket fence. A single income often covered both a mortgage and family needs, allowing room for saving and vacations. Home ownership was a cornerstone of the American dream, symbolizing permanence, pride, and upward mobility, in a time before skyrocketing real estate markets and crushing debt made such dreams elusive. 83. The price of new cars in 1970. A brand new car in 1970 cost around $3,500. For many, it was a tangible luxury, affordable but still a point of pride. American brands dominated the roads. Chevrolet, Ford, and Dodge ruled with chrome, muscle, and flair. Gasoline was cheap, so fuel efficiency wasn't a concern. Instead, horsepower was king. People washed their cars in their driveways on weekends and admired designs that reflected freedom and progress. Cars weren't just vehicles, they were extensions of identity, symbols of personal success, and gateways to adventure. Compared to today's inflated prices and digital dashboards, those simple mechanical beauties carried nostalgia for an era where open roads defined independence. 84. College tuition in 1970. In 1970, tuition at public universities averaged under $400 per year. Higher education was viewed as both affordable and accessible, not an overwhelming financial burden. Students could work part-time jobs to pay their way, often graduating without debt. Dorm life was simpler, no luxury gyms or high-tech lecture halls, just chalkboards, notebooks, and late-night study sessions. Public institutions focused on academic rigor and opportunity rather than profit. The concept of lifelong debt for a degree was nearly unthinkable. That era reflected a societal belief in education as a public good, not a privilege for the wealthy. Many look back at those tuition rates with longing, recognizing how drastically times have changed. 85. Money before credit cards. During the early 1970s, credit cards were far less common, and cash was king. People carried bills and coins for everyday transactions, while personal checks handled larger purchases. Financial discipline came naturally. If you didn't have the money, you waited. Overspending was rare, and debt carried a stigma rather than a norm. Budgeting meant balancing checkbooks and saving envelopes for specific expenses. Shopping had a tangible rhythm, counting bills, hearing the clink of coins, feeling money physically leave your hand. The absence of easy credit kept most households grounded in financial reality. It was a time when living within your means wasn't advice. It was simply how life worked. 86. Life before ATMs. Automatic teller machines, or ATMs, didn't appear until the late 1970s. Before then, banking was entirely personal and time-bound. People visited tellers during business hours to withdraw cash, deposit checks, or balance passbooks. Weekends required careful planning. If you didn't get cash on Friday, you waited until Monday. Payday excitement often meant standing in line at the bank. Despite the inconvenience, the system fostered financial awareness and responsibility. There was no online banking or instant access. Money was something you physically interacted with. When ATMs finally arrived, they were revolutionary, changing how people thought about convenience, privacy, and control over their finances forever. 87. Personal debt and responsibility. In the 1970s, personal debt levels were remarkably low compared to modern standards. People rarely relied on credit cards, and loans were taken only for significant investments like homes or cars. Financial caution defined the era. Families saved for what they wanted, often delaying gratification. Interest rates and bank policies encouraged responsible borrowing, and debt carried social weight. Living paycheck to paycheck was less common because people structured their lives within practical means. The culture valued saving over spending, and financial education began at home. That restraint built a foundation of stability and community trust, qualities that now seem like relics from a simpler, more measured time. 88. Pension plans and job security. During the 1970s, pension plans were standard parts of employment, especially in long-term corporate or union jobs. Workers contributed years of service, confident they'd receive a stable income upon retirement. The concept of job loyalty was strong. Many stayed with one employer for decades. Retirement security was built on these defined benefit plans, not volatile stock markets or 401. It was an era of trust between worker and company, where stability outweighed constant career shifts. Knowing a pension awaited provided peace of mind and fostered loyalty. Today, as pensions fade into history, that sense of mutual commitment feels like a lost promise of a steadier economic age. 89. The single-income household. Most families in 1970 thrived on a single income, typically from one working parent while the other managed the household. This structure reflected both economic balance and cultural norms. Wages supported entire families' mortgages, groceries, schooling, and occasional vacations. Children grew up with a parent often at home, and community ties were stronger. Though gender roles were more rigid, financial stability made life predictable. Families saved, planned, and built futures without the dual income pressure common today. The idea that one salary could support comfort and security speaks volumes about affordability and values in that era, a contrast to modern struggles despite higher earnings. 90. The layaway lifestyle. In the 1970s, layaway plans were the go-to method for financing larger purchases. Instead of credit cards, customers made small payments over time until the item was fully paid off. Only then could they take it home. This system promoted patience, responsibility, and genuine anticipation. Holiday seasons often revolved around layaway shelves, filled with hidden treasures awaiting final payment. It kept people out of debt while teaching financial discipline. Retailers benefited too, ensuring customer loyalty and guaranteed sales. The layaway lifestyle reflected an era before instant gratification, when ownership carried the satisfaction of effort and saving, not the burden of interest and repayment. 91. Littering and the environment. In the early 1970s, littering was common and widely accepted. Highways, parks, and beaches often showed the careless side of consumer culture. Public awareness about pollution was minimal. and trash bins overflowed without concern. Fast food wrappers, bottles, and cans scattered freely, with little thought to consequence. It wasn't until public service campaigns like the famous Crying Indian ad sparked conscience and responsibility that attitudes began shifting. Littering symbolized ignorance more than malice, a lack of education rather than defiance. That casual neglect eventually fueled the environmental movement, awakening a generation to the reality that the earth could no longer absorb endless waste. 92. Recycling in its infancy. Recycling programs were virtually non-existent in 1970. Most households simply threw everything away, unaware of the long-term consequences. Paper, glass, and metal often ended up in landfills without a second thought. Environmental awareness was just beginning to take root, with early activists pushing for change. Municipal recycling bins and curbside programs didn't become common until decades later. The lack of infrastructure reflected a time before global consciousness about sustainability. Yet, the seeds were being planted, Earth Day had just begun, and awareness slowly grew. The absence of recycling in that era stands as a reminder of how far environmental progress has come. 93. Polluted rivers and lakes. In the 1970s, water pollution was a major issue across the United States. Factories dumped waste into rivers and lakes with little regulation. The Cuyahoga River famously caught fire in 1969, symbolizing the crisis. Many waterways were unsafe for swimming or fishing, tainted by chemicals and oil. The environmental movement gained urgency as public outrage grew. The Clean Water Act of 1972 marked a turning point, demanding accountability and cleanup. Before that, pollution was an accepted cost of industry. Those murky, foul-smelling waters became a national wake-up call, proving that prosperity without stewardship exacts a heavy price. 94. The smog of the cities. Smog visibly blanketed major cities during the 1970s. Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and New York often experienced hazy skies thick with industrial emissions and automobile exhaust. Breathing the air could sting the lungs and obscure skylines. Environmental regulation was still in its infancy, and clean air wasn't guaranteed. As public health concerns mounted, the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency began tackling air pollution through the Clean Air Act. The contrast between those smog-choked decades and today's cleaner horizons illustrates progress born from necessity. That era's haze was both literal and symbolic, a fog of neglect slowly lifting through awareness and reform. 95. Grocery bags of the past. Before plastic took over, grocery stores in the 1970s relied on sturdy paper bags. They were biodegradable, recyclable, and often repurposed at home for schoolbook covers or storage. Shoppers carried paper sacks without questioning sustainability. It was simply how things were done. Plastic bags, introduced later in the decade, were initially seen as convenient innovations. Few foresaw the environmental consequences that would follow. The paper bag represented an unintentional harmony with nature, a default eco-friendliness before the word green became fashionable. Looking back, it's remarkable how an everyday object reveals the quiet wisdom of simpler consumer habits. 96. The rise of disposable diapers. Disposable diapers were just gaining popularity in 1970, revolutionizing parenthood. Before that, cloth diapers dominated, washed, folded, and reused daily. The convenience of disposables appealed instantly to busy families, marking a shift toward throwaway culture. Brands like Pampers began reshaping domestic routines, saving time at the cost of environmental impact. Landfills soon reflected the change, filling with non-biodegradable waste. Parents of that era embraced modernity without yet grasping its ecological cost. Still, disposable diapers symbolized innovation and relief, offering a glimpse into how convenience would come to define consumer choices for generations to come. 97. Styrofoam everywhere. In the 1970s, styrofoam was the symbol of modern convenience used for cups, containers, and packaging. Few questioned its environmental toll. Lightweight, cheap, and disposable, it was celebrated as futuristic material science. Cafeterias and diners served meals in styrofoam trays. Coffee came in foam cups. Pollution concerns were distant, overshadowed by a fascination with technology. It wasn't until later that scientists exposed its durability and ecological harm. At the time, styrofoam reflected the optimism of industrial progress when innovation meant improvement, and waste was someone else's problem. That innocent faith in convenience shaped both comfort and crisis. 98. The muscle car era. Gas-guzzling muscle cars were the pride of 1970. Sleek, powerful, and loud, they embodied freedom and rebellion. Vehicles like the Dodge Charger and Ford Mustang defined status, roaring down highways without concern for fuel or emissions. Cheap gas encouraged indulgence, few imagined oil shortages or climate concerns ahead. The era celebrated mechanical power over efficiency, craftsmanship over restraint. Car culture thrived on individuality, and garages echoed with the sound of revving engines and shining chrome. Those muscle cars remain icons of raw engineering and style, capturing a fleeting moment before practicality and environmental awareness reshaped the road. 99. The birth of Earth Day. Earth Day was founded in 1970, marking a monumental shift in global awareness. It united millions of people in a single cause, protecting the planet. Schools, activists, and communities rallied for clean air, water, and land. The event inspired the creation of environmental policies and organizations still active today. For many, it was their first realization that humanity's actions carried consequences for nature. The celebration symbolized hope and responsibility, a collective promise to do better. That first Earth Day planted the seeds of modern environmentalism, transforming concern into action and awakening a consciousness that continues to grow. 100. Before climate change awareness. In 1970, climate change wasn't part of public conversation. Few people understood or discussed the long-term effects of carbon emissions or global warming. Environmentalism focused on visible issues, pollution, deforestation, and litter, while the invisible danger of atmospheric change went unnoticed. Scientists were beginning to study it, but their warnings had yet to reach mainstream media. The world was still optimistic, believing human progress was limitless. Looking back, that innocence feels bittersweet. It was a time of simpler concerns and slower living, but also of ignorance about the silent transformations already underway, shaping the planet's future.